What's going on, everybody? It's Lions Table Talk. I'm Jermichael, and we're back again with another analysis video for the off season. Today, we have a very special guest coming on today, Asa Arnold from Analytics with Asa. He is an analytics expert, in my opinion, and he is here to help me break down whether Jared Goff is truly elite in his field and what Jared Goff's strengths are, what his weaknesses are, and how that translates to the Lions offense as a whole. And we are doing a new segment on this show called Learning the League, where I take follower submitted questions and elaborate on questions that they have about how football works as a whole. So if you have any questions about anything that has to do with the NFL, with football in general, submit it to me at my email that is in the description, and I'll do my best to answer it. Asa is a one-time guest. He helped me answer an additional question this week, so stick around towards the end of the episode for that. But before we get into it, I just wanted to take a moment and just acknowledge what's happening in the state of Minnesota right now. It is a tragedy for that city. No matter what you believe, two civilians being killed like that is devastating, no matter how you put it. And we are praying for the state of Minnesota right now. And I wanted to acknowledge a tweet made by Woodward Sports. I think that it was bottom of the barrel, and it was made to make fun of what's happening in Minnesota, and I don't think that that's right at all. So I just wanted to say Woodward Sports should be held accountable for that and should be like apologizing for it, which they have not. But with all that out of the way, let's get into it. We had some audio and connectivity issues to start the podcast, so it's going to be a little more of an abrupt jump right into it. Sorry about that. We'll have that fixed up for the next time I have a guest on. It was my fault, most likely. So let's get right into it. Is Jared Goff elite? What he does well? See you at the flip side. All right. One of the things I wanted to talk about was Jared Goff's pre-snap prowess, or his chess game before the snap, and that's what, for me, that's one of the strengths that he has. Uh, what is your take on it?
Yeah, I think Goff is great at almost all of the things that require being in rhythm. And so I think you can make the case that he's arguably the best in rhythm quarterback in the NFL. And because of that, I think that he's in a way the offensive genius's ideal type of quarterback because he's great in structure, he's accurate, he rarely makes those major mistakes, and he's great whenever you're using motion. And so whenever you like kind of incorporate all of those things, I think he's great at reading pre-snap things, and I think a lot of that comes from his experience with two of arguably the smartest offensive masterminds we've seen in quite some time with Sean McVay and Ben Johnson. And so it seems like he's really that sort of sponge that absorbs all that information, and being able to diagnose all of those pre-snap things, I think is really impressive from Jared Goff. And so I think that's arguably his greatest strength is that, of course, he has arm talent. He was a first overall pick. And so not surprised to see him have that. But I think a lot of his biggest strengths just comes from the fact that he really is like an offensive genius. And so I would not be surprised to see him succeed for a lot longer, even whenever his arm talent starts to decline. I think he's just so impressive at those sort of pre-snap looks that I think he's going to do really, really well for the time being.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the biggest strength that Jared Goff has is not only his pre-snap prowess, where he can give himself a chess advantage before the snap, so he only has to play checkers after the snap. But the big thing that I feel is his biggest strength is, even though he doesn't have the strongest arm, he doesn't have the most zip out there, his timing and anticipation on his throws makes it so where it does not matter. He's just that good with anticipating where his receivers are going to be and where the defense is going to be, to where he can throw a ball a half tick earlier, a whole tick earlier, to where the defense never has a chance to get set and really understand where the routes are going before his receiver is already behind the zone or right next to the man, to where he can have the ball right there on a zip. And that's what people talk about with timing and anticipation. You can get away with not having zip on your passes if you can get the ball there on time and on target. And that's Jared Goff's biggest strength in my opinion.
Yeah, and we've seen this in several games against Brian Flores. Aside from maybe the games that were this season, he was just great at that because Brian Flores' defense often involves blitzing a lot of guys and still dropping back into quarters coverage or having too deep. And so that generally leaves the middle of the field relatively open. And that tends to be the area that Jared Goff operates in the best, is that middle of the field area. And so up until this season, he was just amazing at dicing up what was otherwise a really impressive Vikings defense. Like, not to turn this too much into a Vikings episode, but last season, the Vikings only lost to two teams, and they were both Jared Goff coach teams. It was the Rams and it was the Lions, and they got beat bad both times. But I just think it's so impressive that despite having a really good defense, to go up against, Jared Goff has like almost always been super impressive on his way to deal over the middle of the field. I think like really the only major weakness that Jared Goff has is not necessarily his fault. It's just the fact that he's not what you would call like an athletic quarterback, and so he's not really the best at sack avoidance. In fact, he's below average at that, and so he really has to pull off that like Tom Brady sort of intentionally thrown incompletion that's not a like intentional grounding sort of incompletion in order to avoid sacks, and that's a lot easier said than done. And so essentially, Jared Goff, when not pressured, is a top five scariest quarterback in the entire NFL. Whenever he is pressured, he drops back quite a bit compared to your average like Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, but those guys are also like the elite of the elite. And so when not pressured, Jared Goff is incredible. When pressured, he's not quite as incredible, but I don't really criticize that too much from Jared Goff whenever the offensive line is not as good as it was, and he's still really, really impactful, despite being pressured more than he was last season.
Yeah, my thing is I noticed an interesting trend. Jared Goff has the type of pocket movement to where he can get around bad tackle play. He can avoid sacks off the edge, but when it comes to the interior offensive line breaking down like it was this year, a lot of guards and centers is either missing assignments or getting blown up, then that's where Jared Goff absolutely starts to struggle. That's where he can't get away from those interior pressures like that because he's not fast, but he's good at stepping up in the pocket, buying an extra half second of time to get his throw off, but you have to have a pocket to step into if that's going to be the case. And a lot of the time this year, especially it was especially shown in those Vikings games, especially the second one. Interior pressure absolutely killed Jared Goff, and even when he was able to get the ball out, it was batted at the line more often than getting to his receivers. And that was just a major problem, especially in the latter half of the season. It just looked like the offensive line was overmatched. I don't think that that's a Jared Goff problem. It's more of a personnel problem. But again, that is one of the limitations you have to think about when you have Jared Goff as your quarterback.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that the Vikings invested heavily in offensive or interior defensive pressure this season compared to last season because last season they had very few weaknesses, but the one major one that they did have is that they just weren't good at getting pressure from the interior. interior. And this season, they kind of solved that problem while also creating some other problems with like a not as good of a secondary. But I think you bring up a good point that it's really tough to avoid interior pressure whenever you're a guy like Jared Goff, who is a great quarterback but is not like the most athletic guy. And really, the only quarterback I can think of that is not really that mobile, but is really good at avoiding sacks, aside from like a Tom Brady type, is Michael Penix. And Michael Penix is not very good as a quarterback, at least so far. But he's one of the only guys that has mastered that like intentional incompletion sort of play whenever you're about to get sacked. And so I don't know if Jared Goff can maybe absorb a little bit of that information, but I think that all of the positives of him definitely outweigh the negatives, considering he's like seventh in the league this season in EPA per play, which I think is really impressive stuff, especially whenever, like you mentioned, the personnel kind of took a step back compared to what it was last season because guys get expensive whenever they're really good. So I think the Lions don't really have much to worry about because Jared Goff's style of play also I think ages pretty gracefully.
If you were the GM of the Lions and you were in charge of going and getting a replacement at center or anywhere on the interior of the line, who would you look to this offseason, whether it be the draft or free agency?
I haven't looked too much at the Lions cap situation, and I'm assuming it's going to be solid because their front office is really well done. But I think one of the big moves that teams should do is make multiple swings at one position. I think a mistake that a lot of teams do is they will sign this free agent and assume that means that they're fully set up. But what happens a lot is the NFL happens and players get hurt, especially at a position like center or guard where naturally there's going to be a lot of contact involved. And so essentially, like it's really important in my opinion to draft as many guys as possible. And obviously you don't have an unlimited amount of draft picks, but the best way to maximize draft capital, in my opinion, is by trading back a lot because you have guys that tend to be sleepers and they may not fit your traditional like physical archetype. But there's guys like the Dolphins center. I can't remember his name right now. It is Aaron Brewer, who he's this little guy. I think he's like 5'11", which is really short for a center. But he's like a monster in the run game because he's so athletic. And so like there's going to be guys like that in the draft. And so in my opinion, like taking a bunch of swings at one position tends to work out because you mitigate the risk of one of those things failing. Because if you only take like one swing at a position, if that fails, you're kind of screwed. You have to like figure something out in the middle of the off season or in the middle of the regular season. But if you take multiple swings at one position, especially if it's like a big position of need, I think that tends to work out pretty well for teams.
Yeah, I agree. The one that I'm particularly looking at in free agency is Tyler Linderbaum. I don't think he makes it to the open market, but if he does, I don't think there's 10 teams in the league that shouldn't go after him because he's just that much of a difference maker along offensive lines. And one of the criticisms of Brad Holmes over the past couple of years, especially last year in the offseason, a lot of Lions fans have felt that he ignored the offensive line last year in the offseason. But my counter argument is he signed a center in free agency, drafted a guard in the second round, and drafted a guard in the sixth. I think that that's a lot of attention to the offensive line, especially considering Frank Ragnow didn't tell the Lions that he was going to retire until after the draft, which is a massive disadvantage to have an All-Pro center just retire without your knowledge, and the draft has already passed. But I think that there's a lot of players, namely Jake Slaughter, in the draft that I think the Lions can go out and take a swing at because the interior offensive line can't play like that again, especially with the news coming out today that Brian Flores is coming back to Minnesota. So if the Lions have to face him again, you can't have interior pressure like that, or you'll have another two losses in the middle of your in the middle of your season with Minnesota, especially their defense playing like that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to separate results from process. So what you mentioned is Brad Holmes going about a good process, but the results just didn't work out. And there's times where you just get unlucky, right? If like Frank Ragnow retires, it doesn't tell the team. That's not necessarily on the Lions' fault. I don't know. Maybe they should hire a private investigator to like figure out whether or not he's actually going to retire or something like that. But it's like a lot of times like stuff just happens, right? And so you can go about a good process, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. And not to bring up the Vikings again, but I think like a lot of that happened with the way that they treated the offensive line this season as well, where they signed a center in Ryan Kelly, who's a little bit older, and so obviously there's injury concerns there, and they did end up like rearing their ugly head later. But they ended up signing a left or a right guard. They ended up drafting a left guard in the first round, and that team was rarely healthy, and so they invested a lot of capital in the offensive line. And I think those were good investments to make. But what happens a lot is like injuries happen, and so that's just why it doesn't work. And so I know this is kind of like difficult to hear for Lions fans, but whenever Dan Campbell said this may have been our only shot, like sometimes that stuff happens where the stars align in the right way, and then the next season you just get completely banged up. And am I expecting the Lions to be as nearly hurt as they were last season and the season before that? No, but it's not a guarantee. You know, like it's just difficult to really to get lucky multiple years in a row, right? And you know, hopefully they don't get as unlucky as they have been when it comes to injuries, but just like sometimes happen, like stuff like that happens.
Yeah. Another small example of that. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but the right process, but bad results. The Giants a few years ago when they drafted Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal both in the first round, I thought that at the time that was just an amazing process. I thought you go get your franchise right tackle and a franchise edge in the same draft class. You're looking at 7, 8 years of just dominating the trenches. But unfortunately, both players just haven't worked out the way you would like it to. I think Kayvon's had good sack production, but the pressures haven't followed, so it's not sustainable. But Evan Neal has just turned into a bit of a draft bust for the Giants, putting it nicely. But they had the right process. It just didn't work out, and that's something that happens in the NFL sometimes. And the thing I wanted to talk about next is the personnel for the personnel that the Lions run. They run a lot of 13 and 12
Mhm.
personnel, and they run zone runs out of that into play action passing. And I just wanted to talk about how much of an advantage that can give a quarterback who really knows what to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a new trend that some teams that are particularly advanced in terms of their like offensive play calling, and what they've realized is that a lot of defenses will still personnel match. So if you're running 13 personnel, which is typically one running back, three tight ends, one receiver, the defense will see that and they'll trot out four linebackers or three linebackers, and that tends to mean that that is a more like run defense friendly sort of defense and a less pass defense friendly sort of defense, right? And so teams like the Rams and the Lions have realized, hey, if we throw out 13 personnel a bunch, we're going to have a bunch of linebackers that we have to worry about, as opposed to a bunch of safeties or corners who are way better at defending the pass. And so teams like the Rams have been hyper efficient on these 13 personnel plays because they've realized these linebackers aren't very good in coverage. They may be able to like stop the run pretty well, but that doesn't matter if I can just throw the ball in them all the time. And so whenever you have a team like the Lions that can also run the ball really well, that seriously presents a threat because these teams have to worry about, all right, do I throw out a bunch of linebackers who aren't good against the pass but are good against the run? Or do I throw out a bunch of corners who are going to get run over by all the tight ends that we have? And so it's like a really interesting dilemma that teams have caught on to is, hey, if I roll out this really heavy package, I'm going to be successful. And it's really interesting because it's almost the opposite of what Jared Goff was used to when he was with the Rams, which was a very 11 personnel, three wide receivers, and just treat the best blocking wide receiver, which was either Cooper Kupp back in those days or Puka Nacua now, as a tight end. And so it's really interesting that we're almost seeing the flip side of that, where whenever you go these really heavy personnel, you are almost paradoxically the best at passing in those packages. And so I think it's really cool to see, and it's unsurprising that like the Lions keep coming up with this like innovative style alongside the Rams.
Yeah, and the thing that I wanted to point out about that, along with what you said, is they don't just use that for heavy personnel anymore. They'll have uh, 11 and even 10 personnel come out and say, "Hey, my defensive or your defensive backs aren't as willing to tackle as my receivers are to block." So I can run out in 11 personnel, maybe even 10 personnel, and just give the ball to the running back and say, hey, there's going to be a hole opened up somewhere because their DBs won't tackle. And that'll just open up the run game. You see a lot of that with Ben Johnson's system, especially in Chicago with Monangai and Swift, but even back in Detroit, he would do it sometimes as well. Sometimes it didn't pan out as well, but they did run the ball a lot on third and long, and it would really work. And then next, I wanted to go into a new segment that I'm doing. It's called Learning the League. We have a couple of questions from people who are trying to learn a little bit more about the NFL and how it works. And each of us have a question here that we're going to answer. And the first one is an interesting one, and I think that Asa would be really good at answering this one. And the question is, how do coaches know which plays to call in what situations? How do they give themselves that strategic advantage? I feel like we've talked a little bit about it, but Asa, you want to go more in depth?
Yeah, I think it feeds a lot into what you were kind of hinting at before, which is a lot of these coaches have become a little bit more analytically friendly with understanding like optimal times to run and pass, right? So the down that people talk about the most in terms of like when you should run versus pass tends to be second down. And the reason why is because generally in second down, you're in one of two scenarios. One of which is second and long, which is where you kind of need to pass in order to avoid third and long, which is kind of like your nightmare scenario. Or if you're second and short, you still should argue that you should pass. And the reason why is because there's a really good chance you're going to convert third and long. So why not take a deep shot now? Right. And so a lot of these coaches have gotten very smart with that, especially the Ben Johnson types. But a lot of it as well feeds into their willingness to go for it on fourth down as well. So coaches like Nick Sirianni or Dan Campbell, part of the reason they go for it so often is because one, they have a really effective running game, and two, it makes it harder to predict what you're going to do on third down. So as you mentioned before, the Lions are a team that likes sometimes, and part of the reason for that is because they're so willing to teams like the Vikings, like other teams, are not going to go for it as often in fourth down. And so because of that, teams know they're going to have to pass in order to get like a third and 10, right? Because very rarely will you get a 10-yard run. And so whenever you go for it more on fourth down, it makes it a lot less difficult or a lot more difficult to predict what the coach is going to do, which is one of the reasons I'm a big advocate of going for it a lot more than teams tend to do. I think we are getting better at it than we were in the past, but there's still some room to grow. But in terms of like actual play calling, we touched on this a little bit, but a lot of it as well is like seeking out mismatches. So there's some head coaches that are better at it than others, but if you notice like there's some sort of weak link on the defensive back room, then that tends to be targeted a lot because it's important to have like an almost even talent distribution of defensive backs because good coaches know how to isolate and hunt for bad matchups, right? So we saw this a lot in the AFC Championship game where Riley Moss is not a very good corner, and so he tended to be the guy that was targeted a lot by Josh Allen. And I mean, even the play that led to an incompletion in the end zone, you could argue that was DPI. But it's no coincidence that Riley Moss was targeted there. And so I think like a lot of the best coaches know how to match up hunt. They know how to be aware of when downs should result in run versus pass calls. And so that really goes into a lot of like this distribution between running and passing. But when it comes to scheme, a lot of that is just like what coaches are best at. And so if you have your Kevin O'Connells, it tends to be like a little bit more pass heavy. If you have your Ben Johnson, it tends to be a little more run heavy. But all that really varies. And so I think there's optimal strategies that people can do across the league, whether that be like going for it on fourth down or things like that. But it's also going to vary on what your talent ends up being like. And so some teams have really good guards, so they're going to run up the middle a lot more. Some teams have good tackles, they'll run outside. All of those things kind of factor into the equation of like what type of play calls you should do.
Yeah, I don't even have anything to add to that. That's a amazing answer, and a little bit of it goes into what personnel you have available. But if we're talking a perfect world, if we're talking no injuries, nobody suspended, you hit the nail on the head right there. But our second question here: what is a safety, and how does it work in the NFL? So there's a couple. I'm going to answer this one. There's a couple of answers to this depending on what you mean by safety, but the one that we're probably referring to is a safety in your own end zone. So basically the field of play is 100 yards and there's 10 yards of end zone on either side. You're trying to get to the opponent's end zone to get a touchdown. But if you're backed up near your own end zone, you're not allowed to go into that part of the end zone and be downed. You can run around in there, you can run a play that drops back into the end zone, but if you get tackled in the end zone, you get a safety, which is 2 points for the opposition, and then also you have to kick the ball to the opposition and they get control of the ball. So basically, this can happen a number of different ways. It can happen on offense where you just get sacked in the end zone. A holding penalty can occur in the end zone, and that'll be an automatic safety. Or in more rare occasions, a team can throw an interception, and the team who intercepted the ball can run into their own end zone and get tackled, and that would be a safety as well. So that's basically the gist of what a safety is. If you get downed in your own end zone, the other team gets 2 points and the ball. And there's another answer to this, which is the position safety, which is on defense. The free safety and the strong safety both have different roles depending on the defense, but the gist of it is they're the back. They're the last line of defense in most scenarios for the defense. They're there to aid cornerbacks in coverage, and sometimes the strong safety will come down into the box and help with the run game, but they're more of the versatile uh, players on the defense because they can cover, they can play in the run game. They have a lot of responsibilities, and usually they're the ones who lead the league in interceptions because they're usually not assigned to a specific receiver. They're usually there to float and see where the ball is going to go. So one safety is a penalty to where you get 2 points to the other team, and one is a position that aids the defense, specifically the cornerbacks. Did I get that right, Asa?
Yeah, no, I think that covers basically all of it.
Yeah, and one last thing I want to get from you. Your final verdict on Jared Goff. Do you think he's elite, and do you think you would consider him top 10, top 7, maybe even top 5 on a good day?
Yeah, so it really depends on what you define as elite. So some people define elite as in like a quarterback that you can win the game explicitly because of them. And so I don't necessarily think that Jared Goff falls into that tier, but in my opinion, that tier would be like your Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and maybe like your Burrow and Herbert, but those guys are also close to that. I think Jared Goff is firmly in the next tier, which are guys that I would call people you can win with. So in my opinion, guys like Jared Goff, I think that Brock Purdy is in that tier. I think Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow are at the top of that tier. Obviously, there's other guys like Jordan Love as well that are hyper efficient. But I think that Jared Goff is really in that tier where you can easily win a Super Bowl with him, just given the talent that he has. But I don't know if he's one of those guys that you're going to pay like $60 million and explicitly win because of. And so I'm a big believer in Jared Goff because I think it's really difficult to captain like two separate offenses that both finish like top five, which he did with McVay, which he did with Ben Johnson. I think that's really impressive stuff. Now, I'm not saying that I would be like putting him in the same tier as these Josh Allen types, but I think Josh Allen is also like I think he's firmly in the I would definitely pay and feel comfortable, but I don't know if he's going to be like the savior of my franchise that a Josh Allen type is going to be. And so if you consider a guy that you would pay to be elite, I think he's definitely elite. If you consider a top 3 guy to be elite, I don't think he's in that tier yet, but I think he's definitely like top 10-ish, which I think is really impressive for him to like really resurrect his career with that
Yeah, I
Ben
think
Johnson time period switch.
Yeah, I think that I would firmly put him in. I don't think that he's the type of quarterback to play Superman, but you can win with and you won't lose because of him. That's the big distinction that I make. Jared Goff, he's not going to single-handedly lose you many games, maybe one a season if he's particularly turnover prone for that game, but most of the time he's not going to miss his throws. He's not going to turn the ball over unnecessarily, and he's going to get the ball to his guys when they're open. And I think that I would constitute him as a top 7 quarterback, and he's firmly in the area like maybe one ranking or two below Joe Burrow, to where I think that he's of the best game managers in the league, but he's not Superman. He has his weaknesses, and those weaknesses will show
Yeah.
up if they're not supplemented. And
I don't want to derail this conversation too much, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Brock Purdy. Where would you have Brock Purdy in your top 15 to top 20 rankings?
oh, Brock Purdy is a weird one because I've been on track being wrong about Brock Purdy before. Because I when we were both on the NFC North roundtable, I explicitly said that Brock Purdy would lose his job to Trey Lance through midseason. Boy, was I wrong about that.
Mm.
um, he came close this year with Mac Jones. Mac Jones very nearly put him on the sideline. But no, Brock Purdy is one of those quarterbacks where he's a game manager in the sense to where he does run that offense really well, but I don't really understand him to be a Superman quarterback, but he can have those Superman plays. In some ways. He's like it's like the 49ers offense is like a Ford Focus, and the guy driving it is is a valet driver who knows how to handle these cars. Like it's a weird comparison, but he knows how to run that specific offense. I don't know how well he would do outside of a Kyle Shanahan offense, but with the production that he puts up, I'd have to say he's at least top 12. I'd probably put him top 10, maybe on his best days, top 8.
Okay. I like that take a lot. A lot of my friends kind of clown me for being what they would call a Brock Purdy apologist. But I think Brock Purdy is great, and part of the reason for that is that he's really good at these like Jared Goff type of things. Obviously, he's a smaller guy than Jared Goff is, and he might not have as much arm talent. But despite being a smaller guy, he's incredible at avoiding sacks, and so he's great at these little like maneuvering plays where he's scrambling out of the pocket, and he doesn't really run the ball a ton, but he's excellent at avoiding sacks and like making the play downfield. But I think that him and Jared Goff are at a similar tier. I'd probably have Goff above him just because Goff's been doing it for so long and he's been doing it across different coordinators. But I think Brock Purdy is definitely in that tier, and so I felt like throwing that out there.
I think that I would, if I were to say one thing about Brock Purdy, he is to me the Patrick Mahomes of Jordan Loves. That's what I would say. he's
Okay. Okay.
he's got that what I would call scoot to him, but he he's not
Yeah.
perfect. But he's a really good quarterback, and despite me comparing him to Jordan Love, he doesn't have that boneheaded turnover like once a game that can really hurt the team. Jordan Love has that sometimes,
Yeah.
and it scares me watching him because anytime he's in a clutch situation, I'm just like, all right, Jordan Love, please don't do what I think you're gonna do, or do, because I'm a Lions fan, because I'll root against the Packers,
Yeah.
especially except when they were going against the Bears. I was waiting so hard for the Bears to to lose. I can admit it, but um, yeah, this playoffs has
Yeah,
been.
yeah, it's
Go ahead.
yeah, it's really interesting to see how Ben Johnson has worked with Caleb Williams because in many ways he's like the anti Jared Goff. So in the sense that Jared Goff is not great at avoiding sacks, Caleb Williams is. Jared Goff is like the definition of consistency in terms of his ability to be accurate and also like facilitate the offense. Caleb Williams is incredibly inconsistent. He was towards the bottom of the league in completion percentage. Um, but Caleb Williams has like next level arm talent that maybe only Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen have. And so I think a lot of people were like attributing this Bears success to to Caleb Williams being this really amazing quarterback. And I thought he played pretty well, and he's made like some unbelievable throws, including the one against the Packers where he's like almost doing the Jordan logo, and then the one against the Rams was like unbelievable. But I think like what people are forgetting are two things with the Bears. One, Ben Johnson is a complete psychopath and is amazing at designing a run game. And you saw that progress throughout the year, where first week of the season, he could not run the ball at all against the Vikings. But after being in like the Ben Johnson boot camp of learning how to run, DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai both got really good at it. And two, the defense got incredibly lucky with turnovers. And they don't have to apologize for those. Turnovers happen, but they got a lot more turnovers than were expected of them. And I'm expecting that to die down next season unless they make some major changes at the defense, which is possible but unlikely. And so I want to throw out my Bears take as well over there, but I do think the Bears are a team that is not a team I want to mess with next season, especially after being in year two of Ben Johnson.
Yeah. My thing is, Caleb Williams has these plays where you just think what is he thinking? But then the fourth quarter hits and he has a clutch gene unlike anything I've seen since Tom Brady. It's really interesting to watch because he'll go down and third quarter trying to get back in the game, he misses a wide open guy. Fourth down, game on the line. He backs himself up to the 40-yard line and throws a fadeaway jump pass to halfway through the end zone to a wide open guy. It's like you don't see this anywhere else. This inconsistently amazing quarterback play. I love Caleb Williams just because of how chaotic he is sometimes. And I'm really scared because if he does figure out consistency, he becomes the best quarterback in the NFC North. It easily. And how are you feeling about your guy, JJ?
Not feeling great. I'll be honest about that. So obviously he's year one. He just turned 23 years old, so he's a younger guy. So it's not like we could expect him to instantly save the franchise. But in my opinion, there's a big difference between being like mediocre and having these like up and down moments that some quarterbacks have had early in their career, and being like arguably the worst quarterback that we've ever seen that has played a significant number of snaps, right? And so I think that's a big issue that we have right now with JJ McCarthy is that the Vikings like built this roster to really capitalize on a cheap rookie quarterback deal. And this really goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where there's a difference between good process and good results. I think the Vikings made what I would call a good process decision by betting hard on this quarterback deal to work out, right? But the results themselves have really not been great so far. And I know people have talked about, oh yeah, but JJ McCarthy was way better in the back half of the season. And some of that is true, but it's largely because Kevin O'Connell had to dumb down the offense. And so if you have to dumb down the offense significantly in order for a quarterback to not just play like the worst quarterback in the NFL, I think that's a really bad sign. And so is it possible that he gets better? Of course, but I'm not really expecting him to be much better, especially whenever you just play that catastrophically bad. And I know there's like Vikings fans on Twitter saying, "Yeah, but look at Josh Allen's rookie season." But generally, whenever you are comparing yourself to Josh Allen, that's typically a really bad sign for a young quarterback because Josh Allen is one of one. He is like the most physically talented quarterback we probably will ever see in NFL history. He was a next level runner, even whenever he was that early in his career, and he developed accuracy. But it's very rare for that sort of thing to happen. And so, in the same way that like signing a former first rounder typically means that first rounder is not very good. Expecting JJ McCarthy to make this sort of like Josh Allen transition is just not really a good sign. And so I think it's no coincidence that the Vikings are looking for veteran quarterback play next season because you can't have a roster this old, this talented, in this like win now heavy and roll out JJ McCarthy at his current state because it's not looking very good.
I just have to point out that the Lions missed the playoffs this year because of the game where the 9 meme was born, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life.
Yeah, that's pretty rough. And I mean, the one thing I'm thankful for in this playoffs is that I mean, there's two things. One, we've gotten excellent games, but also CJ Stroud I think has overtaken the 9 as playing very very bad, and so now based on quarterbacks whenever they're not playing well. And so it's nice to be relieved of that curse. But yeah, 9 is not looking too good for the future. But I hope those things change. Obviously, I'm a Vikings fan. I'd love if 9 does well, but not expecting things to go so hot next season.
Yeah, I saw someone compare CJ Stroud and put him in the 9 jersey, and people in the comments were like, actually, this is kind of disrespectful to JJ McCarthy, so y'all might be off the hook. It's true. But yeah, I just wanted to see if you have anything to plug
No,
before we
exactly.
head out.
Yeah, I have a podcast called Analytics with Asa, and I haven't put out an episode in quite a few months. I might start that back up soon, just depending on like school and all that stuff. But you can follow me on Twitter/X at Asa Arnold 4. It's spelled ASAARNOLD 4. That's where I give my football takes and yap about analytics. But yeah, if you're interested in things like that are very nerdy, then feel free to follow there.
Yeah, maybe later in the off season when we both get into our college football grind, we might do another mock draft to avenge ourselves from last year's. Because I don't know if you look back on that, but I think we got 4 total picks right in the first round.
That's better than nothing. I'll take it, and I'm always down to come and mock with you.
All right, thank you for joining me today, and as always, Asa, thank you for coming, and make sure you have a safe one out there. Everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. Be safe, and as always, go Lions.